Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the 四海为学 collaborative learning project is based. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our 12th roundtable and our 58th event. Today, we are going to discuss silence in early Chinese thought with professors Dirk Meyer, Yuan, and Lisa Indraccolo. This is a really nice lineup of scholars, and it's a really intriguing topic. So I think we're definitely going to have a really great event this evening. Our chair today is Liu Xingding. It's become a tradition here at 四海为学 to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please email me. This event will be 2 hours in total, ending just after 8 p.m. Beijing time. So before getting things started and handing them over to Xingding, I want to say a few words about the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. This 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes we often find, or sometimes find, in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in academic orientation by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are truly open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors Dirk Meyer, Yuan, and Lisa Indraccolo for being with us here today. Our chair is Liu Xingding. He is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. His research focuses on the conceptual and interpretive horizons of Chinese classical thought, with a particular emphasis on 玄学. His doctoral project engages in enduring questions of language, sageliness, and political rulership, drawing on the philosophical tradition of 玄学 to address contemporary concerns in the philosophy of language and political theory. He is also interested in pre-Qin Confucian conceptions of sage and sagely virtue, as reflected in his 2024 publication in philosophical analysis, 哲学分析, titled The Onto-Hermeneutic Analysis of 精神预证 in the Warring States Period. We're very happy to have you here, Xingding. The screen is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor D'Ambrosio, for your kind introduction. And many thanks to all our attendees from all over the world. Again, I'm tonight's roundtable's chair. My name is Xingding Liu. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And it's really my great pleasure and honor to chair this roundtable session titled Silence in Early Chinese Thought. And so far as I know, silence in early Chinese texts is never simply the absence of speech, and rather it often embodies like deep philosophical significance whether it's a strategy for argumentation, as a means for moral cultivation, or even as an ineffable expression of Tao. And our three distinguished discussants today will offer fresh and exciting insights into how early Chinese thinkers used, understood, and theorized silence across different intellectual traditions. And I'm very delighted to introduce our three speakers. Professor Dirk Meyer, he's a professor of Chinese philosophy and a fellow of the Queen's College at the University of Oxford. Professor Meyer is internationally recognized for his arguments as performance theory and his work on the intersection between form and content in early Chinese manuscripts and texts. And his many publications include Philosophy on the Bamboo, which was published by Brio in 2012. This book's Chinese translation came after in 2021. And publications also include documentation and argument in 2021, and the Songs of the Royal Zhou and the Royal Shao in 2022. He also serves as the director of the Center of Manuscript and Text Cultures at Oxford and of the Center of the Study of Excavated Manuscripts at Nanjing University. And also Professor Yuan Ai. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Tsinghua University. Professor Yuan's major research projects include the forthcoming monographs, Nonverbal Communication in Early China, the Tao Companion to the Philosophy of the Tao Te Ching, and Beyond Monism, Logic in Early China. Also, Professor Lisa Indraccolo, she's an associate professor of Chinese studies at Tallinn University in Estonia. And Professor Indraccolo earned her PhD from C.A. Foscari University of Venice and has worked extensively at the University of Zurich. Her research focuses on early Chinese master's texts, 子书, rhetorical techniques, paradoxes, structural patterns of early texts, and early Sino-Japanese Korean cross-cultural encounters. She currently serves as vice president of the European Association for Chinese Studies. Um, uh, Eventually, I would also like to thank 四海为学 team for their immense support of this event. Okay, we now begin the roundtable discussion, and the format is as follows. First, each participant will present their view for 10 minutes. And second, after each presentation, they will have two rounds of discussion with the other participants, each lasting around 7 minutes. Finally, we will open the floor to the audience for the remaining time. Okay, we will proceed in the following order. Discussant 1, Professor Dirk Meyer. Discussant 2, Professor Yuan Ai, and discussant 3, Professor Lisa Indraccolo. Okay, the table will give to Professor Dirk Meyer.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for having me. And also thank you so much for Lisa and Yuan Ai to be here with me today. It's a real pleasure because I consider both I and Lisa my very close friends. And we've had multiple conversations about silence in many forms. And so, yeah, it's a fantastic lineup of yeah, being with you. Thank you so much. So I am recently working on a monograph project on silent forms of argumentation in Chinese philosophy as a performance commitment on the part of the text recipient translating what is not said with words in these texts into, on their part, a performance commitment. And this book is hopefully coming to a close soon. I'm just sort of doing the last tweaks. And largely speaking, perhaps it's fair to say that the book addresses maybe perhaps two things. The book addresses a lack of benevolent reading towards Chinese argumentation by not just Western philosophers, as soon as texts do not exact in words what perhaps they're trying to say. And whereas in the Western context, Martha Nussbaum is of course sort of a hero in this regard and a leader in many respects. Whereas in Western discussions, the literary form of an argument has shifted to include non-analytic forms to express things that can not easily be said in and of course, the Platonic dialogues come to mind, and Jill Gordon has also produced a beautiful a book about the performance commitment in these Platonic dialogues. And when it comes to China, there is still quite a significant gap, and I think the gap is because, first of all, the West has not yet acknowledged that we really need to take Chinese thought products seriously. And if you think, for instance, our friend Jürgen Habermas, who has just produced, well, not just, it's now a couple of years old, but a 1,700-page strong, also a history of philosophy, where he gave the whole of China just 23 pages. There's this crying lack of commitment of what's going on the Chinese side, but also for Western philosophers working on China, we also see that certain forms of analytic reasoning that differ from perhaps those analytic reasonings that we're most familiar with have not had the due treatment. And so when I am talking about silent forms of argumentation in Chinese philosophy, my project really tries to address this lacuna in acknowledging what was going on in China at the second half of the first millennium BC. Now, the second half of the first millennium BC is maybe a fairly random cutoff point from where I'm talking about, but I'm interested in sort of the form of an argument in the Warring States period of Chinese thinking. So what we see is, or what my project tries to address, is sort of the practice of silent argumentation in the Chinese philosophy, but also then to address and provide a range of solutions to the philosophical problems that are raised by this genre of philosophical reasoning. So the first is, of course, the epistemological problem. That is, how can audiences, I should say, in China back then, identify, comprehend, and articulate argumentation if it is silent? Now, secondly, there's then the problem of the metaphysical problem. That is, what determines the meaning content of argumentation if it is silent? And then lastly, we have, of course, the hermeneutical problem. How can we, who are perhaps linguistically and spatially removed from such argumentation that happened more than 2,500 years ago, relate to it and reveal how it worked if, of course, it is silent? And my approach that I'm trying out in my current book project, that fingers crossed will see the light of the day before the academic year ends, is that these problems are interlinked in the sense that the way audiences relate to these problems is how they basically fill the metaphysic meaning content of this. So what is important in my project is that I start with a macro and micro analysis of how meaning is constructed, without, however, ever suggesting an author intent theory, because, of course, we cannot go into the mind of these authors back then. And so rather it is to address from a reader response theory as how it was possible that audiences could react to these texts in ways that I hope to reconstruct in this book. And so to sum up what I think is happening in these texts is these texts, I believe in China of the second half of the first millennium BC, there was a anxiety that between thought and conduct, or the thought and its instituting, there shouldn't be a barrier. And philosophy is always philosophy as practice. Philosophy is always something that manifests itself in the act. And so this anxiety, which I think we can see across the landscape of Chinese thinking, produced a dilemma. On the one hand, we've got philosophical insight that you wish to share. On the other hand, the moment you explain this philosophical insight, you already introduce a mediation or a barrier between its the thought and its instituting. And these texts, I believe, that produce silent argumentation are a direct response to this anxiety. And they try, in the makeup of these texts, to have the reader act out that which the text is claiming, but claiming through form, not words. And so, with this performance commitment, then on the part of the reader, the text is really enabling the translation of the metaphysical truth claim of the text to its ontological instituting on the part of the reader, who then retrospectively, perhaps epistemologically grasps what is going on after the act has happened. So I think that is, in short, the project that I am tackling with this book. Now, one word maybe before I close, I hope I wasn't speaking too long, is the silence that I describe is between the text and the recipient. So it's not a silence within the text. It is a gap that the text produces by interrupting a reading expectation on the part of the reader. This interruption then produces a dialectical response, so to speak, between the text and the audience, or the reader, I should say. And in this sort of dialectic going back and forth, the reader basically comes to, in their act of dialectic meaning production with the text back and forth, come to produce the meaning of the text. So it's important to say that the silences that I describe are not within the text, not on the horizontal level within the text, but between the text and the audience. And then this overcoming of this reading frustration is the act of meaning creation. If that makes sense.
Thank you, Professor Meyer. And we'll have a discussion with participant 2, which is Professor Yuan Ai.
So thank you, Xingding, and thank you, Dirk, Lisa. I got 7 minutes to respond.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Paul and 四海为学 again. Well, we've got the privilege to read Professor Meyer's introduction, the draft of the introduction. So something I appreciate and learn from, as always, is something coming from the introduction, just to make a note. Well, I myself have been working on silence for some time, but still reading this introduction, I'm so amazed and intrigued by what's going to come in after the introduction. I've learned so much together with some questions, so I want to put them together. The first one is that this calling a silent argument in the literary forms manner allow us to see, first of all, that the traditional way of understanding philosophy as propositional, argument-focused, and analytically approach based is something that not shouldn't be and cannot be fully applied to early Chinese philosophy. So that's something that we might think about what defines as a philosophical argument, not necessarily as explicitly articulate, but also inherently embedded in literary forms. And that's something that Dirk has already talked about. And at the same time, what we focus on is that what defines as a philosophical text shouldn't always be limited within what we call the master text, so the Zishu. And Dirk's book will also let us see that silent argument is basically a phenomenon across different genre and widely applied. So that's something that I will find extremely exciting and will be extremely useful for all early Chinese philosophical works. One thing that's extremely exciting for particularly my research is that Dirk Meyer's book focuses on a reader response theory. That's something that, if I'm not mistaken, talk about the way that meaning is produced is something that the audience, and depends on how the audience understands it. And that's something I see different from a speaker-focused, intention of the speaker-focused approach that has been widely adopted by speech act theory philosophers. And that's also something that differs from what I myself studied on nonverbal communication as something that co-created and co-negotiated between the speaker and the receiver. So that's something that I find extremely exciting and extremely intriguing. And I wonder to what extent the speaker's role will, or the scriber or the editor's role will be diminished, and to what extent the audience defines and reconstruct the meaning. By saying that, I'm also seeing this extremely exciting philosophical argument in the introduction that defines reading as not just engaging philosophical act, but also something as a philosophizing itself. And that's something that in speech act theory, we will always think about hearing and reading as something more passive instead of so active. And in this silent argument, what we also see is that reading is not just philosophizing, it's a process of meaning construction and meaning production. So Dirk, tell me where it should end. But at the same time, what I'm reading is that reading is not just meaning construction. It's an act that defines the meaning. And to what extent is the soul element that defines meaning is something that I'm always concerned about. And it will challenge the whole communication theory in a big way. And I think that's extremely exciting. And to what extent it's not the negotiation process, but a part that defines. One last question also relate to the chapter that Dirk and Lisa co-author together. Of a textual unit. Dirk make an extremely exciting argument on to what extent the expected meaning is something that the extra semantic structure of a text in a silent argument, I quote, not only include the argument structures created by textual patterns. So that's something that Dirk's book focuses on, but also the argument structures that inherent to a discourse function and the argument structure inherent to a genre. So I think Dirk's argument focuses on how the later two is something defining the argument structures created by the textual patterns. But I'm wondering, is there any instance that we can see something inherent in the text genre being violated and therefore silently creating meaning by violating the expected structure? Because you always talk about some expectation being violated. And to what extent this violation relate to your co-author chapter can appear in the sentential level, in the paragraph level, or in the larger textual unit level. So where is the guidance that unfamiliar readers can be directed into this philosophical argument silently? So that's my question. Thank you very much. Amazing.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. Now, Professor Meyer want to make some response to Professor Yuan. So please. Oh, sorry, Professor. Oh,
Thank
yeah,
you so
yeah, yeah.
much. That's super kind. I have just seen that I had a hand, which probably came there not by my doing. But yes, I'm extremely thankful for your close reading, Ai. And anyway, it's so nice to have you all here. Very good questions. So um, the reader response theory and the speech act theory that sort of focuses more on the authorial intent and the dilemma or maybe the tension between the two, I think, is one of the main questions that we need to think about. So it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, the first of all, I think methodologically speaking, we must analyze the thought products of 2,500 years ago from the reader's perspective because we simply cannot enter the mind of the authors back then. And so, in the sense to avoid any form of circularity in terms of me imposing something on an author's intent, I must sort of try to, methodologically speaking, that is, I must try to be able to reconstruct how a process might have worked for it to then hypothesize on my part how it would have worked on the part of the text recipient back then. Now, I'm not, of course, saying that authorial intent and reader response cannot also overlap. In other words, I'm not saying that this is just the construction of the reader. In an ideal world, I hope that they would have met in the sense that an author probably would have wanted to guide the reader to come up with certain responses. And so I think we can also see in these texts how certain stable constituents in these texts channel a reader's response. Now, whether, however, this channeling answered to an authorial intent in the sense that I want you to respond to my text in so and so, such a way, is something I cannot claim to sort of hypothesize about. But I imagine that in what happened on the ground is probably something along those lines. But to avoid any forms of circularity in that sense, me entering the mind of an author, I do see those stable constituents in the text that would have channeled and elicited a response in the part of the reader. I can describe them, and I can therefore describe the reader response to these stable constituents. These stable constituents may well have been shaped by some form of genre expectations back then, or perhaps by an authorial intent, or perhaps by the two coming together. Now, I think what is very important to acknowledge for the project that I have in mind when I'm talking about the reader response theory in the construction of meaning in the performance philosophy of silent argumentation is that we often, I believe, commit the problem of seeing reader and author separated in early China. But if you look at what we see in the chronological and material features of the manuscripts back then, they are really one big group of meaning production. And so the readers and the authors are, in fact, one broader meaning community that we cannot really separate in any shape and form. And in fact, your husband has written beautifully about that. So I think that's a very important premise to make, that unlike today's construction, we shouldn't really separate these two groups, but think of them as one group. Now, why then is it the last question perhaps, and I hope I'm not going over time here. The last question is then, when we describe these stable constituents within a text that would have elicited a certain response on the part of the reader, that could have been the genre function, which then an author, intentionally or not, would have followed. And so, in that sense, taking out the author intention is, I think, an important point. Now, to the very last question of how silent argumentation works, and I hope I haven't, I hope I have then more or less responded to all of the questions. So there's again another tension that we have to work with as we're describing with silent forms of argumentation. So first of all, because it is silent, it's easily missed, right? And the genre of silent argumentation would have only that works on the surface breakdown of communication between text and recipient for it to enable the dialogical and dialectical engagement between audience and text with the text. We need two things. First of all is we need a surface reading expectation to be frustrated, so that we come to this dialogical experience or this dialectical experience. But at the same time, this frustration of reading experience must come within wider genre expectations, where this surface breakdown of communication is something that is not entirely unexpected. And therefore, the text is not dismissed as nonsensical. So the text audience continues in their struggle with the text, in the understanding that something will perhaps follow on from there. Because if they think it's nonsensical, they just get rid of it. They don't continue thinking about it. So we have this tension of a breakdown on a surface breakdown of communication, which then elicits the dialectical experience between text and audience. But that must come within the broader framework of genre expectations that something like this is actually philosophically potent and meaningful. And so I think it's in this context that we need to address the silent forms of argumentation that I'm trying to describe. And then it is also to acknowledge that there's no clean in and out. So what in some audiences would have resonated and created a meaningful response to the text, for other audience would have just been nonsensical, and they would have not further engaged with it. And it is maybe in that sense that, because I'm working with manuscripts rather than transmitted texts, some of these texts didn't come into modern day reception because maybe too many groups thought of them as not philosophically meaningful. I don't know. That is something that we might need to consider, but that might be in brief sort of my response. But thank you so much, Ai, for engaging with it. That's very kind.
Okay, thank you, Professor Meyer, for your response. And now let's move on to the discussion with Professor Indraccolo, and also in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Xingding. And thank you, Dirk, for this presentation, for your work on this topic. I must say, I was really expecting something different, of course, when I read about silent argument, and you completely subverted the meaning. And I think that made it even much more engaging to read than what I was expecting. I think this work that you have done in really laying foundation and authoritativeness to these modes of argument construction in early China is fundamental for the field. I also like the fact that, of course, I've seen the draft that you sent, so I am very much looking forward to what comes next, as I has also said. I'm also interested in seeing how you have combined. Well, you mentioned that you also have looked, for instance, in the Shu tradition, for instance. So how you bring into the discussion also texts that are not usually considered philosophical, which I think goes very well with this sort of method also of looking at text that you propose as seeing philosophy as a practice that is basically activated through the relationship with the text, and in a certain sense meaning is actually produced in this relationship that the user of the text or the practitioner or the reader is in the moment in which they're engaging also with the text, which I think also helps to somehow debunk this idea that philosophy is only found in the master's text, for instance. So potentially any text that produces meaning can also have a philosophical reading or be used to do philosophy or be read philosophical, which I think it's a very important point. I do have a couple of comments more related to the draft that I can also send to you later, but I will point out that at least up to what I've read, I would have liked to read more about this idea of the sincerity of the reader or who approaches the text, which is, I think I get an idea what you mean, but I think it's not expressed that thoroughly. What I also liked more in your presentation is the fact that you put more stress also on the performative aspects or the fact that the text has an audience. So I think that this role also of potentially, I would like to ask more about this role of the reader actually, because you have quite a strong accent on the reader in the draft. But I think that it's very important to reconnect to also this performance aspect of text or the role of the reader as a potential medium between the text and the audience, especially if you have also this kind of community idea of how texts are used and performed and transmitted. So I'm thinking about this reader also, what is the role of the reader? Because that somehow otherwise gets a little bit into the direction of the silent reading, but we know that this is actually not just what is done with this text. So I think that is something that I would like to know more about. Also, when you have this very important discussion about the fact that we have this monolithic understanding of philosophy as analytical philosophy or the analytical method, and is the only suitable one or appropriate one or authoritative one to read philosophy and understand philosophy. That is actually something that I would point out, that we have the kind of very selective approach being done to the Western, especially the classical philosophical milieu, because if you think at pre-Socratic philosophy, it has undergone the same kind of prejudice that is applied to Chinese philosophy. Because if you look, for instance, at the Sophists, or they're just or the Laetical school, they're not considered properly philosophy. They've even almost not canon because of this. So I think that creates also a very potentially good background for your argument, showing that even the Western world has been sort of like self-producing this kind of prejudices about its own tradition and somehow devaluing aspects of its foundational theories just based on this. I have a few more comments, but I can also send them to you later. So I think I will stop here so we have more time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Indraccolo. And since we're actually running out of time, so maybe and also the response will also be possible to include it in the recursive discussion like later on. So okay, now let's welcome the next presenter, Professor Yuan Ai, for your presentation for today.
Can I just respond 1 minute? Maybe?
Yeah, cool.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So super important points, Lisa. Thank you so very much. Now, I try to be super brief. So philosophy in early China was a disciplinary attitude towards self-cultivation. And I think what we sometimes miss is that we like to construct the Zibu, the master's text, as a philosophical equivalent to what we see in the Greek tradition. But I think that is by mistake. So this disciplinary learning for self-constitution, I should say, was, as you say, indeed an important aspect that we find across the board in Shishu and so on, but also in the Zi and analect traditions, etc. I really like the point that you make about the pre-Socratic prejudice. I think that's a very, very important one. And we see even more so that how the project of Western philosophy wants to be this post-Socratic analytic experience. And I think that's an incredibly helpful comment. Thank you so much. And then the sincerity of the reader, I think, is an important point because anything depends on a benevolent attitude towards that what you're doing. And so if you've got a dismissive reader, any form of performance philosophy of silent argumentation is bound to fall. So you need an honest, upright, sincere reader with who is able and willing to engage with the production of meaning that is elicited through the text. And then you had one last question about the performance, and I think that is a very important thing. So without the reader or the audience, the text is just text, and there is no performance happening. There is nothing happening. And it's the same as when Confucius said, I wish to be like heaven, what words does heaven make? So heaven is just heaven, but it is our response to heaven that makes heaven a normative element. And the same is true with the text that is going on. The text is only capable of bringing out a text performance through the reader. Without the reader, it's just there. And yes, very, very, very important. Thank you so much yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Meyer. Okay, Professor Yuan, the microphone is yours.
So on Dirk's final note on having a sincere reader and having a real philosophical construction of the meaning, it fits perfectly with the topic I want to share with you guys today about silencing. And because I talked about a communicative silence previously, and I will not repeat about that too much so that you guys will not feel listening to my silence again. I want to share with you more about the part on to what extent people are silenced and to what extent people act to silence other people without explicit acts of actions. And that's something that I want to explore so as to make the statement that if people know how to communicate effectively, then people know how to silence other people effectively. And those are both sides that early Chinese philosophers are very aware of and consciously apply to, but not theoretically put it down. And that's something that I'm working on as a assumption. So I call it a paradox of silence because I want to focus on the both sides, communicative silence and communicative silencing. My topic today is silence is paradoxical. My argument is about some people speak, but no one listens. And this effectively silence people. Sometimes people are silent. They, however, communicate something louder. And more importantly, allowing other people to speak. To say that silence is paradoxical, firstly challenges the false dichotomy between silence and speech, and that's something that I've been working on. This dichotomous reading of silence and speech not only draws our attention away from how silence can communicate and how to do things with silence, but also treat silence and speech as separate areas of study, therefore making us overlook different ways in which we can be silenced. This means that in order to understand how early Chinese texts communicate ideas instead of what they communicate, we need to know the part that are silenced, explicitly or inherently silenced. To break through the false dichotomy between silence and speech, I have argued that silence in early China is communicative. Communicative silence reminds us to listen to what is not said, to explore the intention and emotion behind silence, to explore why certain groups of people chose to remain silent when they can and allowed to speak up, and the conditions and context that which give rise to silent communication. I'm certainly not saying that speech has no value. We all cherish the right to speak up and the justice to be heard. My point is, knowing the dynamic relation between speech and silence provide us with a more profound reflection on silencing and how a person can be silenced way before they utter a word, before their words are exchanged, and while they are speaking to each other, exchanging words, they can be silenced. My textual evidence I provide for today is 2 conversations in the Zhuangzi. They're about figures that are disabled, talking to people who have social and political power, such as the law representative Zichan and Confucius. My analysis shows that while they talk to each other face to face, they are not really communicating to each other. Zichan never really communicate or talk to people who are crippled, disabled, which in the mind of early Chinese philosophy equated to being morally corrupted and being socially inferior. Zichan intends to intimidate the crippled. The words that function to threaten the crippled sage to make them stay behind, while Zichan's words function to justifying his own discrimination by publicly announcing his own political and moral status. The way Zichan silences other people is to let one say whatever one likes to whomsoever, while stopping the speech from being counted as the action it was intended to be. So the speech act constituted in a person's words can never be effective, and in that way, a person can be silenced while talking to other people. Another story appeared in the Zhuangzi between Confucius and another crippled sage, Shushan no To. When Confucius sees that Shushan no To hobbles on his heels, what Confucius sees is a physical incompleteness that permanently marks his legal, moral, and political inferiority. Shushan no To, the crippled no To's past mistakes and legal misbehavior already discredit his current thoughts and words, with or without words. According to Miranda Fricker, the hero Confucius in this context caused a kind of epistemic injustice to the crippled sage. Confucius unjustly discredited the reliability or efficacy of the amputee's testimony due to bias and prejudice. They are wrongly excluded from participating in the practice that defines the very core of the very concept of knowledge. This means that because of the prejudice and bias, that person being able to communicate and being able to be trusted with one's words is denied permanently. And that person's ability to be a knower is denied and rejected. At the same time, that person being able to participate in the conversation, in the communication, in the process of knowledge construction, being capably identified as a knower is excluded. So before speaking a word, Confucius already knows and defines and judges what a person, the crippled, can be, and what the words, the legitimacy and efficacy of the words of the disabled can be trusted. For the Zhuangzi, I argue the communication of having a person silenced before and while talking to each other is even worse. The harm goes into denying that a person can improve, grow, and develop by having a relationship with one another and by having a shared experience with one another while talking to another person. My topic today focuses on the paradox of silence, aiming to show that, well, philosophy of silence in early China is never really a model for philosophy of silence cross-culturally, but it shows the possibility and necessity of going deeper into the field of silence to know what early Chinese philosophy wants to communicate instead of wants to say. And that's my thoughts on the paradox of silence today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. Professor Meyer, now it's your turn to comment.
This is just wonderful, in all honesty. What I really admire about your work again and again and again is the near anthropological breath that you take when you analyze the various aspects of silence and silencing in Chinese philosophy, where you come from laughter to no answers, and now to the point of silencing through, perhaps you could say, noise, which I find very, very interesting. So in a way, your project of silence is also a project of noise, and I find this extremely exciting. Now, I had just wanted to check, but I seem to have put it elsewhere. So the queer theorist Logan Smiles, I don't quite know how to say this name, Smilges, in I think early 2000 has produced this beautiful, or well, this book. I found it really illuminating. This book on queer silence, where two things are perhaps important with regard to your project. The one is to Logan Smiles, queer is not just the LGBT plus community, but to him, queer is any disenfranchised group, or maybe any group that is put in an inferior place, and that includes sort of physically disabled and impaired people. And Smiles sort of produced the argument that in the 80s, because of course him coming from perhaps a gender normative framework, is that in the 80s, silence meant death, because you had this loud community talking about other people being not gender normative in what we or what they considered gender normative. And so that meant that there was sort of a silence about these groups, and that meant with the AIDS pandemic at the time, silence meant death. And that he has transformed into an opposite direction of silence is power, in the sense that a group does not need to respond to the hegemonic noise that is being uttered by sort of the heteronormative framework in this case. But because Smiles also explicitly includes any disenfranchised group, you don't have to read it from a heteronormative perspective, but you can sort of include any disenfranchised situation here. And so in that sense, it is quite beautiful in the sense that, yes, you can obviously see this silence from being silenced, but you can also see this being silenced as a powerful response to a normative noise, so to speak. And in that sense, you can read it through the noise that is silencing, but you can also make the return, that is, you read the silence as a powerful response to that noise, and thus breaking the noise by not giving it any echo. And in that sense, the sort of disenfranchised or non-normative or disadvantaged group has suddenly obtained a very powerful response to the noisy challenge of the hegemony, so to speak. And I think that's maybe a very interesting element that you can sort of add further twists to your reading of silencing, in the sense that this being silenced could always also be a powerful choice on the part of the silenced, so to speak. And so it doesn't need to be a one-sided power struggle that's going on. And in fact, there is, I have just read the first song of the Jonan from the Anhui University manuscripts. You can read in exactly that same fashion. You have sort of this noisy narrative voice in the text, and the silenced woman who never ever gives a response, we never even see. And but in the end, it is the noisy noise voice by the male narrator who has to change in order to obtain that woman. So her silence has transformative power over the noisy dominant voice of the song. So perhaps that might be an important element to think about, how the silenced could also be a willful choice on the part of the silenced in order to break hegemonic noise. I think that is perhaps all I want to say right now, also in terms of time. But again, beautiful project. I'm amazed about the depth and the breadth, and yeah, I look forward to seeing the whole book. Thank you so much.
Do I have time to respond?
Yes.
Thank you. This is definitely an important point, and also something that the talk you gave at the Tsinghua University was something that could be related to about women's acts of silence, being silenced but not really. So the double sword effect of silencing. One thing that I'm always confused about is that to what extent people can identify a certain group of people using the power of silence, or how can I differentiate them from actually being silenced? So then echoing back to what you said about the frustration of the service meaning, but at the same time, there's a larger expectation that something is expected. So I think there's a part of the dynamic there that is quite subtle. And what I find out is that in the receptions of Confucius silence, the part that Confucius remains silent to the ceremonial head of the of certain rulers' ritual suggestions, the commentary actually figure out or have the sensibility towards the potential debate between the powerful communicative silence and the condition of being silenced, and they argue about that. So then I wonder to what extent it relates to the genre you mentioned, or it relates to the expected readers or expected sincere readers. Because my argument is that while many of the communications are expected to be sincere, the early Chinese philosophy also noticed the non-cooperative and not sincere aspect. So those are the part I'm extremely interesting, but also not very clearly understood at this moment. But definitely a powerful adds to the dynamics of silencing and communicative silence. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. And now Professor Yuan will have discussion with Professor Indraccolo.
Thank you very much, Xingding. Thank you very much. I'm really excited about this project. I think we needed this. I thought that someone should write about this for years, so I'm very much looking forward to your book. This is so important because you find a lot of these cues that are often overlooked. And I absolutely agree with you that whenever you actually, especially in anecdotes or sometimes even in dialogues, when you have information, information is relevant. So the fact that when you have these kind of references to the body is not just to give an idea of like whatever extra textual information you have about the setting, the environment. Since you don't normally have that much, whenever it's explicit, it has a meaning, and it's not casual. And I think it plays a very important role, the nonverbal communication. I think you have done a fantastic work, because it's so hard also to go through all these texts and notice these aspects. Or what I would be interested also in reading more, of course, when the books will come out, is how you created this taxonomy of the nonverbal acts that were relevant. This is something that I would really like to see more in detail. I totally agree also, absolutely, that silence is not neutral, that you have this possibility of aggressive silence, but I've never thought before about laughter as a way to silence people. So I think this is brilliant. What I'm also interested about is, of course, we especially if we think about the past, it's easy to somehow misread a certain kind of social cues. And for instance, all the long discussion about there is no humor in ancient China and whatever not. But I'm thinking, have you found cases of behavior that is misinterpreted, whether on purpose or involuntary, in the text? Because that is also a way of getting your way, for instance, deliberately misinterpreting a certain signal. I think that is something that I would be interested to know more about. Something also that I see it's very central, and that will also, I'm glad that my comments will not just repeat what the two of you have already said, but I think the importance, the centrality of the body also, and this discussion about disability and this sort of like silence as a very hierarchical and power struggle, power dynamics that is created. I'm wondering if you have found any references to barbaric tongues as also a way of being considered someone who is like not considered a valuable dialogic counterpart, and so can be silenced or is not able to be up to the conversation. That is something that I would be curious about. But of course, these are all things that you also will be addressing more in the rest of your work. But definitely this idea also of the fact that soundlessness has a meaning, is imbued with meaning, is definitely something that we have to keep in mind. But I think it's really a fantastic project. I'm really looking forward to the way in which you have reinterpreted silence with these also performative haptics dimension to it. That is, I don't think there is anything similar. What I would suggest to look into is the work of Andreas Serafim, who has edited some books on Attic oratory from the perspective looking at the nonverbal cues. Of course, the Greek tradition has always the advantage that, especially in theater, for instance, you do have this kind of explicit references, like what the actor does this and has this meaning, which we often don't have so explicitly. So it's a lot of extra work. But I think it might be interesting to see what has been done also for the Greek tradition, if there are some kind of potential bridges that you could also use there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for not only engaging with this paradox of silence, but also my manuscript. Thank you so much. There's a lot to engage with. Now I have to be really careful with my laughter because you can has the communicative power. I'm really nervous. So I'll pick up something that I'm extremely interested in, and also having some ideas about, but I can't really answer your beautiful questions in full because there are still questions. Maybe Dirk can also help me. So something about the ideas or nonverbal cues or words being misinterpreted. Misinterpreted accidentally is to a certain extent an ongoing process. That's why editors, commentators, and all the reception parallel text are continuing to reinterpret the idea. Deliberately interpreted is something that I try to focus on as silencing, but I think something goes more miserable than that is that sometimes we're not even aware of the fact that we're silencing other people. And that's what gender studies or Mary Beer talk about, women silencing our that's what the very definition of prejudice and bias point to, that we can't really, it's the more social, political, structural silencing that we're dealing with. But like environmental philosophy, every act might count. That's how I understand how we can hear other people. So deliberately, yes, but also no. Deliberately misinterpreting other people, their text, talking about that. But the part that is also sensitively noticed in early Chinese philosophy is unconsciously but deliberately silencing other people and not hearing other people because of the prejudice. And that's something I find very interesting. Not a lot of evidence. Something Dirk gave a talk in Tsinghua might relate to that. And I find two conversations in the Zhuangzi, not so much evidence I can find at this moment. And I love the I love the derogative tone, if there's something that you are asking. There must be a lot. I haven't done a lot of jobs. I think a lot of times, well, I say rhetorical questions can engage in a conversation, but continuous rhetorical question is something that just mutes other people. And then the two conversations I gave about disability, it talk about 物者也. So the person this group of person that we can identify them as disabled. So could be marginalized. That's how I read 物者也. I'm not very 100% sure about my argumentation, but then there's a 非人 related to the 物者也. You're not even a person. So Gavani has a more detailed understanding of that. Things like that. Tonal voice is and then there are some particles that, like Hobsbawm noticed about. I think there's something derogative in that context. About oh yeah, and something about intention, misinterpretation, and deliberately silencing that. While Dirk says that readers take up the methodological wise take up the central role and sincerely performing the moral cultivation of the silent argument, my understanding is that there's two layers. So in the conversation itself, there's misinterpretation. So then a certain understanding, laughter, the meaning of that is negotiated. I say I'm sincerely expressing my gratitude. You say I'm laughing at you. But I think if we look at a textual production, then the editor must have something in mind. So in the editor's mind, the meaning should be very clear. But the editor is playing on the double meaning of the nonverbal element to tell us that the meaning can be negotiated, and we are communicating instead of informing and being informed. And that's the fun part I like. And etiquette and rhetoric. Yes. I found two books about classical studies of nonverbal communication. But I think the material they had was actually more than I can find. I'm very limited in my resource. I didn't really look at excavated manuscript. I didn't go further into the post-Han literature. So at this point, I'm quite limited with the resource. But lovely, and thank you so much for the time and wonderful questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yuan and Professor Indraccolo. Okay, now let's welcome Professor Indraccolo to give. Oh, sorry, Professor Meyer.
I just wanted to add one maybe small detail about this conversation about misinterpretation, whether deliberate or non-deliberate. And I think, in a way, Lisa made an important remark there that information is important. And so therefore we have to sort of find an analysis where in the text, on which level of the text communication, this disruption is happening. So is the disruption happening between text and audience, or is the disruption something that is with information described within the text? And that, of course, then changes a lot about the meaning content that is being derived accordingly. Maybe that's just a tiny side note.
Thank you. Okay, again, let's welcome Professor Indraccolo to give her presentation on the topic of silence.
Okay, I will share a brief presentation here with you. Okay. All right, so I don't have many slides, don't worry. I'm really glad today that my comments will not overlap too much, but actually somehow draw some further points or point out some underlying aspects of the other two presentations that have been given today. So mostly what I want to talk about is something that has in part emerged already through our conversation. So the power dynamics between the silencer and those who are silenced. There are three entangled aspects, I think, to this discourse that I will look more into. Power and we will see what I mean by power, authority, and especially authoritativeness, especially from the point of view of the intellectual tradition, of the later literary tradition, and then the aspect of gender, which is closely related to the body, which has just emerged from the conversation in different aspects. And I think these aspects are all fundamental when we look at early Chinese philosophical texts or early Chinese texts from a philosophical perspective. So in terms of power, and this in part, we will see that the discourse about authority or authoritativeness is reconnected to this. We do have a juxtaposition between those who impose silence also retrospectively, deliberately, which has to do with the traditions like imposing silence on certain events or facts. And this is closely related to the aspect of the authority or authoritativeness of the tradition that is imposing a certain reading or excising certain events or even people from chronicles, for instance. Then we have often when we look, for instance, of dialogues in classical Chinese philosophy, we have those who can exercise the right to remain silent. For instance, one question, and usually these are those in power because they can remain silent. They do not need to answer. And this is usually superiors, lords, kings, or the master, for instance. He can remain silent. Nobody's going to question his position or the fact that he decides to remain silent. And the silence or the decision to remain silent always has a meaning that has to contextualize. Then we have those who deliberately stay silent to make a point. This is also the case of Confucius in many cases, or deliberately decide to remain silent just to let the conversation die. And this is typically done by rulers, especially when they are put in an uncomfortable position or they simply don't want to discuss something further. They just drop the whole argument by remaining silent. And this is juxtaposed, of course, from the opposite side, from those who are canceled from the records, or those who are silenced by the records in the tradition, by the later tradition. Those who are somehow connected to this, deprived of their own voice because they're always featured in anecdotes where they are not speaking, or they are not allowed to speak. Or worse, while their original words are not transmitted deliberately, and they are actually put some words in their someone is putting their words in their mouth to give a certain interpretation of their character, which is something that we will see in particularly when talking about gender and the case of Lady Nanzi that I will mention in a minute. And then there are, of course, those who are forced into silence or left speechless by a winning argument. We see this typically when we have cases of argumentation and one of the two persuaders or people engaged in conversation is reduced to silence because they don't know how to counter-react to a certain point being made. Now, the discuss about authoritativeness is mostly related to the tradition and the fact that we have texts that selectively decide to include or exclude certain events or to give more or less emphasis to certain events that we see, for instance, in the historiographical chronicles, for instance. That is a deliberate way of silencing or just simply producing a certain image that is consistent with a certain perspective, ideological interpretation, political tendency, and this is also a form of silencing. But what I want especially to talk about is the gender aspect, which is closely related with the body, the importance of the body. I've mostly focused on women in my analysis, and that's very interesting. That I really didn't take into consideration the disabled aspect, which instead would fall in part with this under this kind of interpretive frame, understanding more than gender, this queer silence that Dirk also talked about. And typically we have on one side, apart from men in power or of power, that silence others, and that typically also happens with women, but with a specific type of women, as we will see. And then intellectual tradition that is also, of course, reinforcing certain stereotypes or promoting a certain view of women who are allowed to talk or not. And on the other side, what we typically have is the argumentatively or politically powerful independent woman. And here we have a distinction to be made, because normally we have this idea of women being silenced, but there are actually women who speak, and also very persuasively. I'll take this example of Lady Nanze, which is quite famous because she is being silenced by the tradition, while we know that in the Luyu, she's in conversation with Confucius, so she must have had words with him, but she's silenced by the tradition until we get to Liu Xiang's Lianu Zhuang, where she's actually put some words in her mouth to somehow reinforce the negative stereotype that is created around her. So she never actually speaks her own words. What is the difference between her and actually other cases of women who actually speak very powerfully in the Lianu Zhuang? The fact that these women are either basically unmarriageable for different reasons. They're either ugly, so they're almost not women, or they are like children. And one in particular is also orphaned. So people who are like women who are marginalized or considered in a certain way not necessarily attractive or desirable, and that creates a sort of filter through which they're actually taken seriously, very seriously. And that juxtaposes to the fact that we know Lady Nanze was considered also this powerful, apparently also attractive woman. Attractive women should not speak because apparently they create this kind of diffraction through which you can never tell if their words are truthful, or in any case, they represent a problem in that way. So this is a very interesting aspect that is not normally considered and that I would like to draw attention to. So, of course, these aspects are all interconnected, but the fact that Lady Nanze is then basically not given ever the possibility to speak up for herself is quite a case in point. While in the other, we really see women making very powerful arguments and actually also winning arguments with men, and that is clearly related also of their body or the kind of relationship they find themselves with men in power. So I think these three aspects somehow are very important. They're very entangled and they reconnect to the body, but it's very interesting also this connection with the disabled or those that seems to speak from the margins or from a situation that puts themselves, in that case, in the case that Yuan Ai presented, they are despised in a certain sense. In the case of these women, the fact of being somewhat at the margins or undesirable is actually giving them power back in a sense. So that is quite an interesting case that I think I would like to point out. I think I will stop here so we have enough time also for comments. Stop sharing again.
Okay, Professor Meyer, please.
Yes, Lisa, that's just wonderful. Thank you. I love this focus of thinking of silence through the power of tradition. I think this is an extremely powerful case that you're making about Lady Nanzi and how she's basically silenced by tradition, but she's clearly having a chat with Confucius in the Luni. So it's I think that's a wonderful case study that would allow you to really make a much broader claim about sort of silence, authority, and authority as tradition, which is then again later undermined by sort of counter traditions that sort of go against this normative view of how things ought to be. So I would agree that it really would make sense to broaden this perspective of gender, as you already suggested, to include, broadly speaking, marginalized groups, because I do think if in early Chinese literary production, women as a category were not different, perhaps. I hope I was wrong, but maybe I'm not wrong. But women as a category in the hegemonic discourse about women was not so different from any other marginalized group or society. And so I think rather than making it about gender, I would really make it about marginalized groups, broader speaking. And again, I think this book that I cited earlier by Logan Smalks, which I had hoped to have, but seem to have given it to a student, is a nice way of sort of thinking about this broader aspect of a marginalized group that's actually the majority, maybe even from a theoretical perspective, in that sense. So what I also love about the project is sort of how it cuts between I and my project, how it thinks about the dynamics, but on a then very different plane. So while I is thinking of silence as it is given representation through the information within the text, and as I am talking about silence that is through or that is cutting between the text and the recipient of the text, you're talking on a much broader framework of how silence is actually instituted through tradition and normative frameworks. And so it's coming on a much broader plane. And I think that's a beautiful addition to sort of the landscape of thinking about silence that is so desperately needed for early China. So it's a marvelous project. So what I would really love to see is if you could sort of from this Lady Nanzi as a point as a case in point, broaden this out to a sort of theoretical um, monograph length project about the silencing power of authority that then finds itself undercut in various aspects and how it's responding to it. So it's a beauty. Yeah, just would like to congratulate you on this beautiful project. Yeah,
Thank you. No, thank you very much. No, this was really a fantastic meeting because I was mostly seeing like this aspect of women being silenced. So, and also, I have this tendency of thinking often of disabled people, especially in the Zhuangzi, as someone who is actually being somehow in power in the conversation or eventually having the last point. So this idea that instead there is always the scorn or sometimes also the fear against certain groups or the despise, it's something that definitely I would have included in the slides now. And this idea of silencing as a form of power of those who have the power to stay silent, but also to silence other people. I think it's very interesting, and I think that's something that we do have in passing in several publications. But I think this consistent idea of what is the process of silencing people and what is the relationship, because there is this idea also that we have this somehow misinterpretation that those who remain silent are necessarily always in power. That's not always the case, or the fact that remaining silent can also be used aggressively, not just to dismiss something, but also, as I pointed out, just to stop a conversation, to silence someone by remaining silent, and somehow exploiting one's position of power to do so. Because, as I mentioned, not everybody is allowed to remain silent when they're questioned. So I think that is something that definitely could lead to some more interesting conclusions. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I think this is an extremely important point you're making, and that also shows the complexity of the study of silence, in particular the one that you two do, because at which point is silence power, and at which point is silence being silenced, and at which point is silence a choice, and at which point is sort of the disabled voice in the Zhuangzi a sign of weakness or power, or a comment by the third narrator who we don't meet and who's sort of adding a further twist. So it's just really intriguing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Yuan. Yeah,
Thank you.
for comments.
Privilege for me to hear this firsthand speak. Thank you very much. It's marvelous, and Dirk has beautifully summarized our conversation here. This is such a topic I've been thinking that also, yeah, it has to be written down. And I myself always have question about gender silence, and in light of all the confusion discussion of women and ideas in ancient China, I think a lot of recent contemporary discussions on women being silenced and will be something that give us ideas as well. One thing you highlight about is the social structural expectations of what women can speak, and something that might violates the expectation and put into a woman's mouth in the right way or in the opposite way. And that's something extremely related to our understanding that all the authoritative speakers who can speak and silence other people are all male. And then some philosopher will remind us that it will be impossible for a society to imagine that women can also have an authoritative voice, given exactly the same words, content being delivered and uttered. Then this will be a kind of expectation that silence is something that you wouldn't even be able to think about. Like a decade ago, we might not be able to think that women can be educated or should be educated. So something that kind of silence is invisible and untouchable, but they are everywhere because of the dominant discourse that make people impossible to think in a certain way. And that's also something that Dirk talked about. Not engaging with the hegemony is one way to counterbalance the power inequality, but also sometimes people don't even be able to think about the act to counterbalance. And that's something that's quite sad. I'm afraid that nowadays, okay, anyway. The other way is that I'm curious to what extent women were silenced in ancient China, because nowadays we will hear, oh, certain group of women are very angry, and that's a stereotype, or certain group of women are always submissive, and that's one other bias. So I wonder to what extent. So I remember Milburn said a laughter of a woman was always indicating being uneducated, uncontrollable, and therefore uncultivated. So that's one element. And your discussion of Nanzi is definitely the other powerful element. I wonder what other elements are hidden there that might require, but extremely important element of silence that you discussed, and extremely exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very powerful thing that happens also, that is later tradition just silence. Not only she's silenced, but later on she's done additional gender violence by the fact that in this anecdote in which she is represented very negatively in the Lienu Juan, they actually make her say something that somehow reinforce the negative stereotype, which she might not have seen. And she's also represented like as having a lover. That is, we have no idea if that was true or not. So she is deliberately constructed as like evil, corrupted. If we look originally to where she's mentioned instead in relationship, of course, with Confucius is actually is extremely annoyed of being questioned for meeting with her. So we have to assume that Confucius, who always knew what was best, actually would not have met with someone who was not worth his time. Several times he refuses to have audiences or to visit people he doesn't consider worth his time, or worse, to be corrupted, to be negative characters. So in any case, if he has met with this woman, we have to assume that, first of all, she had something to say, and that whatever she had to say was worth his while. So that already creates an important precedent. And the fact that there is already this stigma against Confucius visiting this woman, because we have this, I think it's Zhegung saying was really displeased that the master had visited Nanzi. And that somehow already gives the idea that there is this idea that it's inappropriate. It's probably all about her is inappropriate, starting with the fact that she was basically the regent for her husband, who had decided he had enough of government and didn't really want to be bothered anymore. But she is in power. She's literally ruling a state. So everything is wrong about her, starting with that she's occupying a position that should be a man's position. And that is the first problem, and probably one of the biggest problems with her, that really disrupts the constituted idea of order. And that's probably where all these problems arise. So the fact that she is proposing herself as a peer, that is a problem also. And not only a peer, technically, as being the ruler of the state, she's superior to Confucius hierarchically. So that creates also a lot of problems from a ritualistic point of view. So she is really like a walking problem, basically. But then you really have the tradition trying to, and from the Lienu Juan on, it only goes worse and worse, of course, on representing her negatively. But something similar also, of course, happens with Yang Weifei, that, again, beautiful woman, so she must have something wrong about her. But it's very interesting, this idea also that somehow being exposed to beautiful women is like listening to music. It will just corrupt you. You will not be able to understand what you're thinking anymore. You just cannot trust your own self anymore. And it seems that instead, when you have like a child or like a ugly woman, then you can actually listen to her because you're not distracted. So that tells us something about these powerful allure of women also, that how in a certain way like they were reduced to their body or bodily appearance in a way that is very different from what we think of like Rong or Si as being like this idea of more like exuding moralized behavior that you have that is positively associated with men. With women, it always has this connotation of like corrupting or seducing others. So in women, it assumes this negative connotation, but it's a very important aspect of the way why women are marginalized in this discourse also. Thank you. You're muted, Cindy.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Professor Indraccolo and Professor Yuan and Professor Meyer. Okay, now it's time for the audiences. Should you have any further questions for all the three discussants, You can raise your hand or put your question in the chat. Okay, while we are waiting for the audiences to put up questions, can I have a quick question for Professor Yuan about the paradox silence? I think your talk is quite intriguing that you are talking about the silence, especially like silencing some not very general in the form that we not generally considered as a kind of silence, like the laughter, like the noise as a silence. So my question is that I'm wondering whether there would be a issue of like generalization of silence, or if there is this kind of issue, how would you tackle this kind of overgeneralization of silence? Like whether there would be an issue that we consider too many things into the conception of silence.
Do you mean that we might misconceive a normal miscommunication into acts of silencing?
So yes. I'm just asking whether we have to draw a line between silence and would it be possible to draw this kind of line?
Well, intention and attitude always matter, but I think there's one argument that I'm always cautious about, but I make that argument by saying that word, speech, silence, acts of silencing, being silenced, actually can be put on a continuum. There's a point that we might not be able to even know that we're silencing other people. There's a point that it's just genuine miscommunication. But I think contemporary literature, legal cases, and Zhuangzian cases, also the Nanzi situation, also repeatedly show that the conversation was not meant to be a communication, but it meant to be a derogative order. So those are the things that we can clearly see. But then at what point this is somebody making a honest mistake doesn't really matter, because what matters is that everybody get to be having a chance to be trusted at the first place. So that would be my assumption about communication to be, in the first place, as Dirk said, cooperated and genuinely participating in a reading experience, performance experience. So if that sort of, yeah.
Thank you. Now we have a question in the chart. It's from Park. They said that they have a question for Professor Meyer. Yes, I just read it out. If I understand correctly, you argue that the text and the reader form a kind of holistic loop in which the reader interprets the text under the guidance of the author. If that's the case, it seems to me that every reading is relational and that there is no objectively correct interpretation. With this in mind, I would be interested to hear how Asian Chinese thinkers might have approached the issue of correct textual interpretation.
Thank you so much. That's a good question. I'm not quite hoping to make that point, but it's good to sort of get this clarification. So what I believe, so first of all, the silent forms of argumentation that I hope to describe is a genre of philosophical reasoning in early China. So not any text, I would claim, falls into this genre, and therefore not any interpretation makes a text argue a certain claim as seen fit by the reader, which I believe is your question. So within the genre of silent argumentation, which as every genre, there are certain bounds, but those bounds are flexible, what falls in and what falls out. both on the part of production and on the part of the recipient. That means even if we think of an author intention theory, what an author might want to elicit in a text recipient might not always arrive at the text recipient, and vice versa. You will have potentially the situation where a recipient is generating meaning from a text that had never intended to generate that meaning, which would be fine too, because in the end, meaning is being produced. But what I'm claiming in my hopeful theory of the genre of the performance philosophy of silent argumentation is that the texts make a truth claim. And so there is therefore a text objective directiveness in these texts that, however, needs to be activated through the performance commitment on the part of the recipient. And when I'm saying recipient, I always mean a switched on reader. And switched on because if you're not showing a benevolent attitude towards the text, then the text will fail to come to fruition through the reader. So in that sense, the text, I would claim, builds in certain stable constituents that channels the response that the text hopefully aims to elicit in the reader. However, from a methodological perspective, I don't want to sort of approach this theory of silent argumentation from an author intent theory, because I hope not to be circular in my reasoning, but rather I'd like to sort of show how I can reconstruct a response, and on the basis of that response, I can then construct that genre of silent argumentation. So it's a methodological question that does not say anything goes in the reader response theory and the reader makes the meaning. So it's an interplay between the two, and an interplay that only works within the genre expectations of both the text production side and the text recipient side. And if those two don't meet, then even if a text intended to be generating meaning through silent forms of argumentation, it would not come to fruition because it would not have the recipient. And the other way around, even if a text did not mean to engender this meaning, it could still happen if there are certain things that would be triggered within the reception of a particular reader. And so in that sense, it is important as a next step in order to avoid making so in order to avoid that I describe a freak occurrence of a weird text and that is it. It is important that I can describe such a response happening not to just one particular text, but across a wider spectrum of meaning production in early China. And so as soon as I can describe such a response in more than one text, I think I'm on a track for describing a genre that would otherwise remain undetected. And so it's important that the two come together. It's not just a modernist theory, anything goes, but it's really, if I cannot describe those stable constituents in the text that elicit the response of the reader, then I would think it would have to fall out of my analysis. And so I hope, does this respond to your question? Does it?
Thank you so much, Professor Meyer. I noticed that here we have Abigail Wang, who made questions, so you can speak up.
Thank you. Actually, I also have questions for Professor Meyer. I guess it's because I'm still getting familiar with this reader response theory, and I don't have a chance to read or draft. So I may have misunderstood part of an argument, but I'm really interested in understanding the concept of silence and the role of reader you're highlighting. So when you describe silence as existing between the text and the audience, are you referring to a kind of concept that invite the reader's participation? If so, I'm curious why you choose the term silence to describe this space. And since silence by definition isn't directly observable, and how do you identify or study the silence in the text that you examine? And also, you argue that the meaning was produced collaboratively between the author and the recipients who belong to the same group. Could you elaborate on what kind of text you're studying to determine who those recipients are, or how the text signal their expectations of audience engagement? And also in your talk, you emphasize the role of the audience or the reader in meaning production. And you describe silence as used
Juan.
about
Sorry to
who this
interrupt.
audience is.
Your connection is not very stable, so we just lost you for a while. So
A
yeah,
while.
could you
Okay.
just maybe 1 minute you can start talking about
The last point.
1 minute.
Just the last point was lost.
Okay. The last point is I'm confused about who this audience is. Are you referring to us, the modern readers, or to the original recipients of the text in early China? And if so, I don't think that the recipients are that much different from the authors. I mean, at least the distance between us and them are not that different.
Yes, thank you. Very, very good question. Let me begin by the last with the last one. So I'm of course hoping to reconstruct the response of the second half of the first millennium BC reader. Now, my claim is that their response and my response to these texts differed slightly, because in their response to the texts, the decoding of the information and its translation into meaning should, according to my theory, have happened only as a secondary step. Because as the first step, this genre of silent argumentation tried to avoid mediation and tried to install the thought as it's instituting at the same time. And so my response is definitely is necessarily a different one, because I'm not part of this genre community at the time. I must go via this step of information decoding to then come to the point of reconstructing the performance commitment on the part of the audience with response to the text that has not exacted its stance with words, but rather through this inciting of a performance commitment in the reader. So I give you one example, if I may, just because it's a super brief one, and hopefully that's an easy one to share if I can. In an ideal world, you see a bit of the l'ONU here. So just because also to make the point that the silent forms of argumentation that I'm describing is not only sort of crafted argumentation that go over the length of an entire book or something. So it's a very brief thing. So the master, that's Confucius, said, for a whole day I spoke to Hui, and he retorted not once an objection to what I said, as if he were lacking in ability. So we retired and examined his conduct, and indeed he sufficiently illustrates my teaching. Hui is clearly not lacking in his ability. So what is happening here is that Confucius takes us as a reader on a journey, which is quite funny because he's talking. I mean, it's near graphical humor, graphical, not in explicit, but sort of as a comic book. So he's talking the whole day and he's just not getting any response from Hui and is frustrated and retires and then only realizes that Hui, in his not responding, has already responded, or not responded, but has actually instituted Confucius' idea of "I wish to be without words," which he elaborates elsewhere. And so, in his not responding, Huizi is not only not responding, but is actually actively acting out that which Confucius is doing. That in us is a performance response that takes us on the same journey that Confucius was on in his realization of what Hui is doing. Because we first we realize Confucius' expectations and we go through the same steps in our conversation with this text as was Confucius in his conversation with Hui. So we reconstruct that same experience in us as we take on the same journey. So we come to see that in our expectations we behaved in the same way as Confucius, so to speak. And so we have a couple of such various forms of I mean, we've got long ones, we've got short ones. But what we have is sort of the situation in which the way that the text wanted the reader to respond is not coded as an information in the text, but it just produces the constituents that then elicit a response that is hopefully performative in its engagement with the text and trying to tease out meaning, and therefore brings that text to fruition in order to enable its meaning to sort of stabilize or to occur. Yes, and so it is silent because the text does not say what it wants from you. And the silence is not that it's sort of a lack of verbal communication within the text, but it's a silence between that what the text wants from you and your response to the text, if that makes sense. I think, and you had a third question, which may now escapes me.
But would you say that we as modern readers, what role do we play here, and how do we relate to the recipients back then?
So I cannot, of course, answer that question, but my role is to broaden the remit of what Chinese philosophy entails and bring to the attention a form of analytic reasoning that works on a different plane of analytic study. Oops, oh, there you are back. You just disappeared. And so, my function is to reconstruct an experience in antiquity that is part of a philosophical commitment, and that is so far not being described. And so, therefore, to broaden the philosophical toolkit that enables us to bring Chinese philosophy to the table of world philosophies by having it speak on its own terms. That's all I want to do. And I can do this only by describing or reconstructing the experience that I think audiences will have had to these texts, which I do by doing something very different to what those communities ideally would have done. Namely, I decode information while they probably, hopefully, decoded information only as a secondary step. But again, this is a spectrum where there's not a clear in and out, but a spectrum where in each case a situation would have different from from reader to reader, from audience to audience. So it's not a black and white in and out situation I'm describing. Thanks for your questions, which I hope I could answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wang, and thank you, Professor Meyer. Since we start like 5 minutes late today, so we still have time, like 3 minutes or so for one last question. May I have a quick follow-up to Professor Meyer's response to Wang? Actually, I'm curious about like what you're talking about, like the interaction between the text and the reader, and it also makes me feel. It reminds me of the contemporary hermeneutic theory, especially the Gödemerian theory of fusion of vision. Like they also put much emphasis on the interaction between text and the readers and how they collaboratively contributes to the interpretation of the text in the sense of the contemporary philosophical context. So how would you differentiate your theory with this kind of hermeneutic theories? And at the first stage, would you think this would be necessary for you to differentiate yourself from this kind of hermeneutic theories?
No. So I don't need to differentiate my theory, but my theory is perhaps a further facet of this broader conversation that maybe was summarized with Gadamer, but I mean you have Karel Kozik in the early 20s, the Czech theorist who wrote this really not easy to read and very um, uh, idealistic discussion of dialectics of the concrete, where he sort of reconstructs certain phenomenological theories from the reader perspective. Then, of course, you have Wolfgang Iser with the text response theory from the 70s and the early 80s. And then you have this big Gadamer accumulation of the fusion of horizons. So it's all part within this broader understanding that what Bakhtin would have said, we always forget that it's not the text that communicate to text, but it's readers that through text communicate with other readers. And so this idealization of the text as the one thing that speaks just doesn't work within a more anthropomorph understanding of it is always the reader who is actually constructing the meaning. It's always what happens on the ground. So I don't think there's any need to sort of differentiate sort of Gadamer's and other theorists' notion of a meeting point of understanding. But it's important also to acknowledge that many of these theories come from a very Euro-Greek centric point of view. That doesn't disqualify them as meaningful or relevant for us. I mean, if you, for instance, think of Deleuze and Guattari and their discussion of what is philosophy, where it's an extremely Eurocentric view of philosophy and also disqualifying the East, as they call it, from entering the philosophical conversation with the West. But if you strip that away and you come to their idea of philosophy as the production of concepts, and then we suddenly obtain a hard language on which we can enable China to participate in this, what ought to be a world conversation and not a North European conversation. And I think that's just an important element to add, that we have an old tradition of dialectics in China. It's not a Greek invention at all. It just works on different premises and with different parameters. And we've got sort of a fusion of horizon, which is not something that is limited to a conversation of me with the Greek text, but it is a fundamentally human experience. And so it's maybe just a little stone to add to this mosaic that thinks of a global humanity rather than different traditions. Because in the end, I do think that you and I think very much alike. And I think that there's also a continuum of how I think and how somebody in antiquity thinks. And so I think it is maybe in the end just a project that tries to overcome linguistic barriers and traditions of reasoning and see that actually there's a lot that we all have in common in how we work with these texts in antiquity and in present. And if you think of, for instance, how you see these Platonic dialogues play out, where that Jill Gordon describes so beautifully in her Turning to Philosophy, is that all these literary forms that have long been neglected in the study of the Platonic dialogues are actually an important point in the philosophizing project of Plato. But whereas she would explain it through the element of a psychological response that is installed in the reader, in particular to her stress of shame that is generated through the lack of understanding from the reader towards these dialogues. My project thinks not from a psychological response, but from a performative nature of bringing to life that which the text is doing, which I would believe is also applicable to the Greek theory, not to the Greek theory, to the Greek texts, but starts again from a very different premise. So it's maybe just a level up just because I'm 20 years later.
Thank you so much for your answer. It's quite helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, since we are reaching the end of this roundtable, and thank you again, Professor Meyer, Professor Yuan, and Professor Indraccolo for your rich and thought-provoking contributions to this roundtable. And thank you also to all our audience for your engaging and thoughtful questions. It has been an absolute pleasure to chair this stimulating conversation on silence in early Chinese thought. And I hope this discussion will inspire further reflections and research on the subtle yet powerful theme. And I wish you all the very best in your research and hope you